This is class number 8 for preparing for His coming, and I want to go over a refresher of our last class because it's been a few weeks since then. And I just want you to remember that we were going through the 7 seals of Revelation, and we matched them up with what Jesus spoke in Matthew 24, and they match up exactly, some of them word for word with one another. And that's kind of where we finished there, talking about how we see a clear picture of the rapture in both Matthew 24 and Revelation chapter 7. In Matthew 24, Jesus says, after the Great Tribulation, you see these signs in the heavens, the sign of the Son of Man. He will send out His angels, and with the sound of a great trumpet, they will gather His elect. And we're going to talk about the elect tonight. But He will gather the elect together with Him. Also, in Revelation chapter 7, between the 6th and the 7th seal, the 7th seal hasn't been opened yet, what we see is that John is in heaven, and all of a sudden he sees this great multitude of people that just appear out of nowhere, and he doesn't know where they've come from, but the elder that's with him tells him these are the ones who have come out of the Great Tribulation. And so we see the picture of the rapture in both places. I just wanted to refresh your memory on that. Tonight, I want us to start off talking about the importance of the timing of the rapture. There's a lot of people that are just kind of have the mindset that it really doesn't matter. But it does matter, at least in my viewpoint. And I want to talk to you a little bit about why. There are about 4, at least 4, is more than this, but the ones that we're going to focus on tonight, we're going to focus on 4 of them. There's the pre-trib view, which says that the rapture takes place before the 70th week of Daniel, before the 7 years that Daniel prophesied about take place. There is what's known as the post-trib, trib being the tribulation. The pre-trib view is they believe that all 7 years is the Great Tribulation. I disagree with that. But then there's the post-trib view, which they believe that the rapture takes place after the Great Tribulation, which is what I believe, but they go so far as to say that we go through the wrath of God. Even believers go through the wrath of God, and I disagree with that. There is what I believe, and that's known as the pre-wrath view, that we go through the Great Tribulation, but the Great Tribulation doesn't even start until the 3.5-year mark of those 7 years, the 70th week of Daniel. But then we are raptured before the wrath of God is poured out, which most likely will go through 5 or 6 years of those 7 years, probably closer to 6 years than 5, of those 7 years. And then the wrath of God is poured out after we're gone. Then there is the preterist, or I'll just put preterist here, but most of them today are partial preterists. They're not full-blown preterists, but they believe that there's not really a rapture. They believe that Revelation has been fulfilled, Matthew 24 has been fulfilled, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 has been fulfilled. Some of them, but not all of them, believe that the world is going to get better and better. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But let's go back. We're talking about the importance of the timing of the rapture. Now with this view, it kind of breaks off into 2 different branches of the pre-trib. Okay? I have friends that are in both camps. One of them says that we're going to be out of here before any of the bad stuff happens in Revelation and all that stuff. So we don't have to really worry about it because God's going to take us out early. And that's really a dangerous view to hold, in my opinion. Because you're taking the warnings away, you're taking the judgments that are coming, not the wrath of God, but the judgments that are coming upon the nations for a variety of different things, and the wrath of Satan, and we're going to talk about that tonight as well, that's coming. So, you lose the preparation of the people in that regard. There are persecutions going on today for Christians. People are being martyred. I read about just this morning, I read about 4 children that had been beheaded because they were in a Christian family over in the Middle East. And it's just tragic. But there are people that are going through tremendous difficulties and persecutions today. And so, even if you take the rapture out of the picture, our country needs to have a mindset of preparing for difficult times. Now, I believe that we're closing in on the return of Jesus, and so it certainly applies to that. But even if that's not anytime soon, the way that the world is headed, the way that our country is headed, is that we have difficult times coming, and we need to get ready. But this first view says that we're going to be out of here. The first of the 2 of the pre-trib views says we're going to be out of here. We don't have to worry about it. And so it's kind of a stick your head in the sand and move on. But there is another camp in the pre-trib view that says even though we're going to be gone, we believe that we could see some challenging and difficult times. And so they teach on this view. John Hagee would be one of those. David Jeremiah, Tim LaHaye, they believe that there's importance in getting the message out, not just because we may see persecution or we may see some challenging times before the 70th week of Daniel, but they also recognize that people may get left behind from their view, and they are going to need to know after we're raptured so that they can come to Christ. Now that is not what I believe. I believe that we're not going to have the left behind scenario play out like they have been teaching. But anyway, there's 2 different camps in there. One of them, I'm much more okay with the group that says we need to be ready and prepared for difficult times, even though they don't believe that we're going through the 70th week of Daniel. But the other one, it certainly is a dangerous position to say we don't even have to worry about it because we're going to be out of here. Now the post-trib view, it's actually much closer to what the pre-wrath view is and what I believe than the pre-trib view. Yes, there are some issues and there are things that we could discuss and debate, but what it says is that you're going to go through the Great Tribulation, just like the pre-wrath view, and they believe we even go through the wrath of God, but I believe, if I'm correct, that they teach that there is a protection on the believers during that time. But even though we have some differences, we are much closer than the pre-trib and certainly the preterist view of that, because they're preparing people to go through the Great Tribulation, which is what the pre-wrath view tries to do as well. As I've already said, the pre-wrath view says we're going to go through a good part of those 7 years, and we need to be ready, and we need to warn people and teach people and prepare them as best that we can. Now this group right here is the one that is the most dangerous, in my opinion, to hold. There are, like I said, there are 2 camps here. There's the partial preterist and the full preterist. The partial preterist believes that everything except the coming of Jesus has already been fulfilled. And that's all that's left to be fulfilled in the book of Revelation and other places like that. The full preterist, in my opinion, is heretical. It teaches that Jesus even came back in 70 AD. And it's a very scary thing to say, because you take the hope of his coming away from people. And Paul addressed Hymenaeus and Philetus, and he said that that is not of God. But the partial preterists, many of them, not all of them, but many of them teach that that the world is going to get better and better. When we look at the millennial views, 1,000-year reign, we're going to run across one that's called the post-millennial view. And a post-millennialist believes that things are going to get better, and generally they fall into the partial preterist category. Things are going to get better, the world is going to be Christianized, and then Jesus can come back. That view is a very dangerous view as well, because you don't expect anything bad to happen. You don't believe that there are any signs to watch for. So you take away the vigilance, you take away the warnings, you take away the preparation and the watchfulness of Jesus coming back. So, for me, this view right here, there's one verse in particular. We could look at a lot of them, we've already looked at some of them, but there's one verse in particular that is quite sobering to me. And that is Revelation chapter 3, verse 3. Revelation 3, verse 3 is talking to the church in Sardis. We've already looked at this verse, but I just want to emphasize how important this verse is. It says, "Remember, therefore, how you have received and heard. Hold fast and repent. Therefore, if you will not watch, I will come upon you as a thief, and you will not know what hour I will come upon you." So what we see here is that having some understanding and some vigilance and some watchfulness for his coming is really, really important. Because if you don't, he says, you will be caught unaware. You will not be ready, and I will come like a thief to you. Now, we've looked at 1 Thessalonians 5 as well, where it says that he's going to come like a thief, but not for those who are his followers and are watching and ready. He says, you're not in darkness that this day should overtake you like a thief. So, to me, part of the importance of the timing of the rapture is to warn people to be living in light of his coming. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about, there's actually a couple of things that I want to talk about, but the next thing that I want to talk about is the idea of when the wrath of God takes place. The pre-trib view holds that all 7 years is the wrath of God. I disagree with that strongly. I believe the wrath of God is at the end, possibly a year or so. We know that one of the trumpets lasts for 5 months, so we know it's not a literal day that he's talking about. But the wrath of God, I believe, is at the end and not all 7 years. So the question is, when does it start? And if it's not the wrath of God through the first 6 seals, what is it? And I believe that it's the wrath of Satan. And we're gonna take a look at some of those things. So the question that we're asking, is it God's wrath or Satan's wrath? If you read through the seals, you're not going to find a mention of the wrath of God until after the 6th seal. Okay? When the 6th seal is opened, you have the kings and the men and the people of the earth hiding in the mountains and under the rocks, and they are crying out for the rocks to protect them because the wrath of God has come. Now, that phrase, has come, does not mean they've been going through it. It means that it has arrived. It is there now. So, the wrath of God has not been taking place until after the 6th seal is opened. That's the first reason why it's not God's wrath that we've been going through at this time. It's Satan's. The second reason is that most pre-trib teachers teach that the first seal, which represents, they believe that it represents, like I do, the Antichrist, false religions. But the problem with that is that if this is the time of God's wrath, that would mean that God was sending false Christ into the world to deceive people, even his own elect, because that's what Matthew 24 says. If possible, even the elect will believe this and be deceived. And I personally take issue with that because I don't believe that God can use the enemy. He can use people that are unrighteous. He can harden their hearts like he did Pharaoh. But what I do not see him doing is tempting people, because God cannot tempt people. He cannot lie. And so he is not going to be sending in false Christ to deceive even the elect if possible. The third point is that if the Great Tribulation is God's wrath, that would mean that he would be responsible for killing and martyring his saints. because that's what happens. In that time, Satan is, we're going to find out when we get later on in Revelation and also in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and in Daniel, that Satan is given authority over the saints. And so if this is God's wrath, why are the saints suffering? Why are the followers of Jesus being crushed and persecuted because of their faith in Jesus? If this is God's wrath, then his people are suffering because of it. And the last point that I want to make, in Revelation chapter 12, verse 12, we see, and when we get to this point in Revelation, we're gonna analyze it more in depth. And what we're going to find is the timing of when this verse takes place. And I'll tell you right now, but we'll look at it when we get there a little bit more in depth. But the verse in chapter 12, verse 12, it says, "Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows he has a short time." So what we see here, what has led up to this right before, is that there's this great war in heaven, and it takes place in the midpoint of the 7 years. And like I said, we'll explain how we get that later. But this event, there's going to be a time where Satan is kicked completely out of heaven and he is stuck on this earth. Now, some people ask the question, wait a second, I was taught that already happened, that Satan was kicked out of heaven before Adam and Eve were even in the garden, and that he lost his place in heaven. Well, that's what most churches teach. That's what I believed for many years. But then I was reading this, and I believe the Holy Spirit led me to begin to look at Job. And then there's another place right here in chapter 12 that we'll see here in just a minute also. But in Job, Job is after Adam and Eve, okay? But Job, he sees this, or at least we read about when the sons of God, in the Hebrew, that's B'nai Elohim. And it means, it always, every instance in the Old Testament, it's Hebrew, and it means the sons of God are angelic beings. It's always for angels and not for human beings, okay? So in Job, the sons of God come before God to present themselves, and it says that Satan came with them. And he is in the presence of God in heaven, not on earth. He's in heaven. And the Lord asked him, where have you come from? And he says, from going back to and fro, back and forth from the earth. So what we see is that Satan, when they rebelled, I believe they lost their complete dwelling in the fullness of God. But there are multiple levels of heaven. And we know also that in the New Testament, Satan is described as the prince of the power of the air. So he is in the lower heavens, is where he dwells now, but he has access to the throne of God, or at least to some presence of God. We see that also because, and this will tell you for sure, that Satan, this event has not taken place yet. It's yet future. Because in Revelation chapter 12, verse 10, well, let's start in verse 9. It says, "So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, 'Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down.'" So this event is future because he has been before God accusing the brethren. Who are the brethren? The followers of Jesus. So since the time of Jesus, he has still been up in heaven bringing accusations against us. And of course, Jesus is our mediator, and he paid the price for our sins, and his blood covers us, and so he stands mediating for us. But he has been in heaven, having access to God to talk and to accuse us. And that tells us this is a future event. Okay? So, now go back to verse 12. It says, For the devil has come down to you having great wrath. This is his time of wrath. God's is yet to come, and it's going to be so much more powerful than what Satan has. But Satan knows that his time is short. He's kicked to the earth. He's stuck here. And we're going to have an interesting viewpoint of that when we get to chapter 12. But this is a future event, and it's really important to understand that. But it's also important here to see that this is the wrath of Satan. Now, I want us to go back to Matthew 24, and we're going to start a new little topic here. Next week, we will be in Revelation 8 through 10, looking at the trumpets of God. But in Matthew 24, there's a really important little detail that we need to look at. Now, in verse 21 of Matthew 24, it says, "For then there will be great tribulation." Okay, and this is after the abomination of desolation, which is right at the midpoint. So the great tribulation does not begin until after the great tribulation. Then in verse 29, it says, "Immediately after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light." You see these cosmic signs. You see the sign of the Son of Man in verse 30. And then he is coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now, in verse 31, it says, "And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." Now, for me, I believe that the natural reading of this, if you hadn't been taught anything, which is where I was at, when you read this, I think it's very natural to see this as a picture of the rapture. Okay? You've got him coming on the clouds, where are we going to meet him when we're raptured? In the clouds. You have this great trumpet blast. And what signifies the rapture? A great trumpet blast. Then you have these angels who are gathering up the elect and bringing them to Jesus. Which, again, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it says that we will be gathered to him. So you have very, very similar wording. This, to me, is extremely clear that this is the rapture. But I also recognize that many people, most people hold to the pre-trib view. Okay? That's the view that has dominated for many years. Seminaries, many churches, TV, and a lot. Now, that is changing, and it's moving. You've still got a lot of people who believe that, but you have a very large push in the partial preterist viewpoint, and those that think the world's going to get better. But right now, we're not talking about them. We're talking about the pre-trib view. The study of eschatology, the last things, the end times, the second coming of Jesus, it's a challenging subject. It requires a lot of time, and a lot of times it's easier to rely on what other people have taught, or to have a mindset of what you believe, that the eisegesis that we were talking about earlier on in our class, to take what you already believe and try to find it in the Word. If you believe something and you take that belief to the Word, you're going to find it probably in there, instead of finding what you believe from the Word. And I believe that this is what has happened by and large with the pre-trib view. That a lot of people came to this viewpoint and then began to teach it in seminaries and at churches, and people just kind of accepted it without actually trying to get into the details of it to find out if it were true. I'm not challenging anyone's integrity here. I think we've got a lot of people who are very honest and have spent a lot of hours in it, but I think that they have already come to the Word with a mindset or a belief, and they have tried to build the Word around it. I have already said, but I wanted to believe the pre-trib view, but I just couldn't find it in the Word. And when you see it here, it's very clear unless you have a lens already blocking you from seeing what the rapture is here in Matthew 24. But There is one problem here. If you hold to the pre-trib view, you have a problem because it says immediately after the tribulation, the Great Tribulation, which is mentioned earlier, okay? So you have what looks to be like the rapture here taking place after the tribulation. So if you hold to the pre-trib view, you have to try to do something to understand this verse. The way that I would see it is we explain away verses. I was a master of it for many years. Of yes, this is what it said, but it really doesn't mean that. And so you try to find a way out of it. The question is, how do you explain away the fact that this takes place after the tribulation? And the way that they do that is in verse 31. And it says, He will send His angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together His elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So the question is, who are the elect? Because if the elect are just general followers of Jesus, it blows the pre-trib view out of the water. It totally breaks down the foundation of that teaching and that belief. If you can say that the elect are not followers of Jesus, then it supports that view. So what I want to do right now is I want us to look at what that word elect means. Okay? That word, get rid of this real quick. In the Greek, that word is eklektos. E-K-L-E-K-T-O-S. Eklektos. And it can mean chosen or elect. Okay? Chosen or elect. That word is used 23 times in the New Testament. We're not going to read all 23 verses of it, or times that it's used, but we are going to look at some of those tonight because I want you to get an understanding of what this word means. Now, when you read, sometimes it will say chosen, and sometimes it can mean elect, but it is the very same word. In the English translations, we sometimes go back and forth on it, but it's the very same word. So, is he talking to the followers of Jesus, or, as most pre-trib teachers use, is he talking to just the Jewish people here? That's what their explanation of this word elect is. He's talking about the Jews. Because in the Old Testament, they were known as the elect. So, let's look from the New Testament what it says about this word, how it's used. Let's look at Matthew chapter 20, verse 16. Matthew 20:16. Now, this is the end of the parable of the workers in the vineyard. This is where you have the master who hired someone to work for a day's wages, and they agreed to the wage. Then at the end of the day, when the day is almost up, he went out and he hired some more people. They worked for a very short time period, but they got the same pay as the ones who worked all day long. And the ones that worked all day long were upset, and they thought it was unjust and unfair. And he says, isn't this my money? Can't I do what I want to with it? Did you not agree to work for that price? And so this is how he ends it here. In verse 15, he says, is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things? Or is your eye evil because I am good? And then in verse 16, he says, so the last will be first, and the first last, for many are called, but few chosen. Now, in this context, we're talking about salvation. We're talking about whether we work for the Lord for all of our lives, or most of our lives, or whether we're like the thief on the cross, who at the very last minute gave his life to Jesus and received, at least for eternity, basically the same reward as those who have been in the body of Christ for all their life. And so in that context, he says, many are called, but few are chosen. The next one is in Luke 23:35. Luke 23, verse 35. Now this is a little bit different usage here. In verse 35 it says, "And the people stood looking on, but even the rulers with them sneered, saying," talking of Jesus, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ, the chosen of God," or the elect of God. So in this phrase, it's saying that Jesus is the elect. He is the chosen. And of course, they're mocking him and challenging that. But that he is the chosen one. He is the elect one. Now, Colossians chapter 3, verse 12. Now, at the beginning of chapter 3, we're going to look at verse 12, but at the beginning, the very first verse, he says, "If then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above." But he starts out, now granted, back when Paul wrote this, he didn't put the chapters and the verses there, but this is the thought process that he's going through. If you are raised with Christ. So then he goes on and he tells them what they need to live like because of that. But then he goes in verse 12 of chapter 3. He says, "Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies." And he goes through another list right there. The elect of God. Who are the elect of God? Those who have been raised with Christ. Okay? Now, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 10. Now this one we're going to see a different usage. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 10. Paul writes, "Therefore I endure all things for the sake of the elect, that they also may obtain the salvation which is in Christ Jesus with eternal glory." So in this context, he is talking about the Jews, the Israelites, those who have had all of the promises given to them in the past, in the history here. But it's very clear from the context who he is referring to. Now, two more. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 10. Oh, excuse me. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 9. He says, "Coming to him as to a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious." Obviously talking about Jesus. Isaiah 53, he was rejected by men so that we could be accepted. He says, "You also as living stones are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." And he goes on to talk about how Jesus is the chief cornerstone. And then verse 9, he says, "But you are a chosen," an eklektos, an elect generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Now, I must say that this cannot be the Jewish people, because the Jewish people had certain priests that they had to go to for sacrifices. Here, he says, you are a royal priesthood, a chosen generation. He says, you've all been made priests. Well, how have we been made priests? Through the high priest, Jesus, and through his sacrifice. So it's important to understand here that he's not talking about the Jewish people, because they weren't a royal priesthood as a whole. They had priests, but they in and of themselves were not. But those who have come to Jesus have become and been made priests through him. Now our last verse is Revelation 17:14. Revelation 17, verse 14. John writes, "These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is the Lord of lords and the King of kings. And those who are with him are called chosen," or elect, "and faithful." So here we see that the elect, after the time of Jesus, it can refer to Jews from the Old Testament, or it can refer to Jewish people who are believers of Jesus. But what we see is that Jew and Gentile have come to make one new man. And the one new man is the elect now. Anyone who has put their faith in Jesus is chosen and elect. So for us to read in Matthew 24 about the elect, it is a stretch to me to think that he is talking just to the Jewish people who will eventually accept Jesus, or just to the Jewish people who have accepted Jesus now. Because he's talking about, in general, the elect. There is no distinction made about whether it's Jew or Gentile. It's the elect because there is no distinction now. We're all one new man. And in Matthew 24, who is he talking to? He is talking to his disciples, his followers. And he is telling them, just as he is telling us now as his followers, when you see these things, get ready. If you're in Judea, you flee. That's still applicable for those people who are in Judea who are followers of Jesus. And there are some, Jewish and Gentile, the one new man. But the elect is not just the Jewish people and not just the Jewish believers. Today, it is all believers. And it's pretty clear from all the references in Scripture. I didn't read all of them, by the way, because you get the idea with just the ones that we have looked at. Okay. But if this is what I say it is, what I believe it is, not what I say it is, because that's not up to me to say, but if it is what I believe that it is, to the average, just a follower of Jesus, then this is absolutely the rapture. Because it says that we're gathered up with him coming in the clouds, with a great trumpet blast, and we see a very clear picture of the rapture. Now, if you have questions, and I know in talking to some of you that this has challenged a lot of what you've been taught, and that's okay. Being challenged is good. I enjoy conversations with people who have differing viewpoints, if it can be done in a loving and gentle manner, okay? Because we learn from one another. When I began studying these things, after I came to what I believed, I began to say, okay, what do others teach and what are they believing? I wanted to believe a pre-trib rapture. And so what I did is I began to see what other people were saying, even though that's not the conclusion that I came to personally. It was one that I wished was right instead of what I had. So I began to read Tim LaHaye, John Hagee, David Jeremiah, and I learned a lot from those guys. They had some things that I hadn't thought about, but in listening to a differing viewpoint, it made me solidify what I really believe. It made me say, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And I went into it and I tried to get into the details of it to figure it out. But what I found was there's just no solid footing for that teaching, even though it sounds good. What you find, and like I said, we addressed some of the arguments that, or not arguments, but some of the issues that they teach and believe in the last class. And I've got that handout if anybody needs me to email it to them. But there just wasn't solid footing. What you find is that there are a lot of things taken out of context. If you take that verse out on its own, it may seem like it's showing a pre-trib rapture. But, and just like this in Matthew 24, you have to explain away the plain and simple reading of it. I think most people, if they don't have the teaching of a pre-trib view, they believe this is the rapture. This is where Jesus comes and takes them home. But because we've already had that mindset, we have to try to explain it away. These things are not salvational. I don't want anyone to ever think that, somebody that holds a different view to me in regards to this is not going to heaven, or, number one, that's between them and God, but I know that there are many godly people that disagree with me, and that's okay. But I do think these things are very important. And I think that it's important that we try to chase after truth. But in order to chase after truth, you have to be willing to unlearn some things at times if the Lord shows you something different. if nothing else, you need to be able to put aside what you've been taught, to test it, to make sure that what you're hearing is right. We've had a lot of seminaries that have, churches as well, and families as well, that have kind of created cookie cutter people. Not in all areas, but especially in this one, because of the difficulty and the time that it takes to examine these things. We've had a lot of people that have just kind of, well, that's what I've been taught. When you get into a discussion, as I've said also in another class, I'm okay with you disagreeing with me. You can believe in a pre-trib or post-trib, even the preterist position, if you can prove to yourself. You don't have to prove it to me, although I try to be teachable and open to change if I need to be. But especially to you. Believe it, where we could get into a discussion and you can say, this is where I find it in the Word. Because what you find is a lot of times people will say, yes, I believe this, I'm pre-trib, I'm whatever. But then when you say, okay, why? Show me from the Word why. Well, then, or even if they try to pull out a few verses and you say, well, what about this? Or what about the elect and how it's used in there? Then what it falls, generally, not everybody, but a lot of people fall back on is, well, that's what John Hagee teaches, or that's what Tim LaHaye teaches, or that's what David Jeremiah teaches. And I don't really care what somebody else says about something. I want to know what God says about it from His Word. So for you be convinced of what you believe because you see it straight from the Word in the context of the Word, not yanking verses out and not trying to explain things away or twisting. And if you can do that, then you have a clear conscience and you can believe what you believe. But do not rely on what others have said or taught or believed. It's great to learn from people. But even for me, I don't want anyone just to take what I say as law and gospel and go and run with it. I tell my church and I tell you, you test what I say. You look at it from the Word and see if what I say is right. And if you have a question, then come to me in love and say, I don't know that I agree with this, or what about this, and we can have a discussion, because it's from our differing views that we learn. I learned a lot, not just about what I believe in the rapture and things like that, but I learned a lot of good things from people who disagreed with me, and that's how we learn. And that's about all that we've got for today. Next week, like I said, we're going to be in chapters 8 through 10 of Revelation. We're going to look at the beginning of the wrath of God, and I look forward to being with you. Thank you.